What's up, everybody? This is Kaz Danazon with Crash Productions, and today we are joined with Rich Whitehouse, the creator of the BigPEmu, or the how do you pronounce it?
I usually say BigPEmu, but you're free to use whatever pronunciation you like.
Rich is responsible for the creation of the currently notorious Jaguar emulator that has been circulating around on the internet, which is of course in partnership with Digital Eclipse, which we'll probably get into here in a little bit. Rich, why don't you give us a little bit of history about who you are as a person, a developer, and what brought you to the Jaguar? What fascinates you the most about it?
Yeah, so I'm Rich Whitehouse. I've been working on video games for, probably 20, 25 years now, something in that range. Um, Started off really young, doing mods for, Quake and Half-Life and stuff like that. And then I got to working with Raven Software kind of through those mods, which I could go more into that. It's kind of an interesting topic in itself, and like whether that career path is still viable these days, and a lot of interesting social dynamics there. But anyway, so that that's kind of my origin story. I've worked on a whole bunch of games throughout my career, and ended up working with the Digital Eclipse guys, kind of due to my interest in reverse engineering. Kind of got involved in the Video Game History Foundation, which led to me doing a project with Aladdin for the Sega Genesis. And I wrote an article kind of like digging through the source code for that game, revealing like a bunch of stuff that was unused. And that actually kind of triggered us going on to do an actual Disney collection with Aladdin and the Lion King. And I worked on something called Aladdin the Final Cut in that, and it was basically like kind of a fixed up version of Aladdin for the Sega Genesis, getting feedback from some of the original designers and people who worked on the game, and trying to create an improved version of it. And my work with Digital Eclipse kind of continued from there. And so the Jaguar kind of got on my radar just as being a function of the fact that like back when the Jaguar came out, I didn't have a lot of money. My parents didn't have a lot of money, so I remember seeing games like Kasumi Ninja and being like a big fan of Mortal Kombat at the time. I just wanted to try all the games of that genre,
Right.
and I never got a chance to, and so I never got to experience all the glory that was Kasumi Ninja until until a bit later on in my life. um, but yeah, so kind of being a function of the fact that I couldn't experience it very nicely through emulation with the offerings at the time. I think I've been kind of checking in throughout the years and being like, yeah, I don't want to experience these games for the first time. With what's on offer here, because it's just not probably close enough to the intended hardware experience.
Right.
And so just being one of the people that wanted to do that myself, I was kind of lamenting at one point to my wife, yeah, I always wanted to mess around with the Atari Jaguar and try some of these games out, but I just never got one. And she ended up buying me one for Christmas that year. So, so I finally actually got to kind of go through the games and experience them, have some fun. But it of course remains kind of on my hit list. I added it to my bucket list basically. I want to write an Atari Jaguar and actually open all this stuff up to everybody, make sure everybody can experience this stuff, both from like a personal interest and a preservationist perspective and all that. And so when the opportunity to actually write this thing came up for the Atari 50 release, I was pretty ecstatic. And it's like, hey, this is already on my bucket list, guys. It would be awesome to be able to do this as part of an actual contract.
Right.
And so early on, we kind of approached it with like, hey, you guys are paying me for this work, you own it. But it would be great if, because this thing is on my bucket list, I could continue to work on it after the fact and continue to develop it. And so that's why I was able to actually do this public release of it, because they were so kind to work with me on that and make sure it would be possible.
Well, first off, I just want to say that it's incredible. And as of the
Thank
making
you.
as of the making of this video, I do have it downloaded on my Atari VCS, ironically enough. And the goal with that is to actually do a video on how well it runs emulation on the VCS. I did several videos in the past. It was supposed to be part of a 5-part, but I never completed it.
Yeah.
Mostly because of the fact that emulation is a very questionable topic for many people, and so I kind of got a little discouraged and I pulled away from those videos. But I did review Jaguar in the second video, and I want to do an update on that as well. Now with this emulator, that means that fans of Atari can, who are probably leaning into possibly getting a VCS, is something that they'd be like, hey, it can run Jaguar games, if it works. I haven't fully tested it out, but that also makes me want to ask another question here. Does the emulator also support CD support for the Jaguar CD, or is that something that might be in the development? Are you able to disclose on that?
Yeah, that's something that's basically number one on the hit list right now. So I have a Patreon account, and I did a Patreon poll to basically get interest and say what priority would you like me to put all these features in,
All
and
right.
not surprisingly, Jaguar CD support is number one.
Yeah.
Um,
Speaking of which, when the video releases, I'll also drop a link to that Patreon for you in the description below, along with your website, so that way people can know, who's responsible for creating this and what that development is going into, and so on and so forth.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Actually, I really appreciate you. I'm a pretty big Atari Jaguar enthusiast, so being able to talk to you about this, first off, I just want to say is an honor. It's a pleasure to be able to talk
Yeah,
to you face to face.
absolutely, man. I mean, if I, declined to speak to you for like an hour, I'd be kind of a jerk face. So
Regardless, I appreciate it, you know.
yeah.
Um, but getting into the whole, I don't know if you can really talk about the creation process of the emulator, but one of the biggest questions that I want to ask is, was it with the history of, Jaguar being hard to develop for, was it hard to create this emulator? And are you able to walk us through like that process and that inspiration?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it's hard to define hard in this context for me, if you know what I mean,
Right.
because it was definitely complex. So I kind of approached it from an R&D type of standpoint because when we were initially discussing possibilities
Hmm.
for Atari 50, we were discussing which platforms can we do, which games, and of course, the Jaguar came up, and I pounced on it because it was already something I really wanted to work on. But even though I really wanted to work on it, it was still very much an open question of can this be done within our actual production constraints and timeline and all that.
Right.
And so I approached it by basically saying, okay, give me a month to basically just like research all the possibilities to see if there's anything existing that we might want to base this on, or if we were just going to need to start from scratch. And so, I did all that research. I looked for any available documentation I could find on the hardware. Um, and I concluded in about a week that I don't think it's going to be really productive for us to start on any basis on anything, both due to complexities in the licensing and just the fact that I think most of it would need to be rewritten anyway for the sake of performance and such. And so that was the conclusion. I started working on that emulator. Probably not even a week into that research phase. And by the end of the month, I had Tempest 2000 running pretty nicely with sound and everything. And so that was kind of the springboard to say, okay, we're going to do this. At a minimum, we'll have Tempest 2000 in the collection, but but I'm going to shoot for more. And so, by the end of 3 months, I basically had it to a point where it could actually run the entire retail cartridge library pretty reliably.
Right.
And that's what shipped in Atari 50.
Now this is kind of a little bit of a loaded question here. I mean, as far as emulator goes, as I said, that it can be a relatively sensitive topic for some people. And the Jaguar is um, one of the most supported consoles for homebrew communities, right?
Yeah,
Did
I didn't know that coming into this, and I've been really a bit surprised by all the support, even on my Patreon, like right after Jaguar CD support is debugger developer enable builds is number two, which caused me to realize, hey, I have a whole lot of actual Jaguar developers behind me on this. So
so there's a particular question I want to ask, and it's more along the lines of a curiosity, trying to get your thoughts on it. So you said that the emulator itself kind of it handles the original retail library, which is roughly about 55 games, give or take.
yep.
Um, so actually, it's a two-part question. One, so you have to optimize it specifically for each individual game, not just just trying to find the correct way to ask this question. Because obviously, with any emulator, you have to optimize it to run on certain things and support certain hardwares, operating systems, stuff like that. But I guess what I'm trying to ask is, was it hard to get it to work around every single game? Because there are some that are harder to work with through emulation, like, say, for example, AVP or, Club Drive versus something like Bubsy or Zoop, which, just kind of plays naturally because it doesn't require so much to emulate.
Generally, the approach that I take there is that I try to avoid anything game specific. And so, if a game is broken, I try to find out why, and I try to fix it in a way that is, going to work with the entire library still. And so there was a lot of that where I'd encounter broken functionality, figure out exactly, what the difference is with hardware, write a bunch of tests to run on hardware, and then I'd fix it. Then I do a quick smoke test through library again, make sure everything was fine.
Right.
And I ended up actually writing some automation for that, which basically allowed me to just run a process. It would then load up each game, play back a movie running through each game using the existing state of the emulator, take a screenshot at the end of it, and it would then compare that to a screenshot from the previous run and say, if that's different here, take a look at this. And generally, if the fix was okay, that difference would be benign. It would be like stemming from something systemic that I did in the emulation and just like change timing or change, whatever the end state was. But there are many times where that would actually reveal, oh, something actually broke in this game. So then I'd get to figure out, oh, I had this particular bit wrong, and this is actually what's going on with the hardware. And typical development process probably.
So this is I said this was going to be a two-part question. I think you actually answered the question about as far as like optimization and getting everything to run accordingly based off of the general what's the word here, programming. But the other part of the question that I want to ask is, so with there being a heavy homebrew community, and the original retail library being kind of open source at this point, with what was it, Hasbro basically releasing it to the public, how do you feel about some homebrew people who may be concerned that their games might be emulated through this. I mean, is there anything that you're doing to combat against that, or do you think
Oh,
it's
do you mean like copy protection type
what I
stuff?
was trying to ask ultimately was so there are some people who do homebrew development who don't release their games on the internet specifically for the sake that emulation can take away from sales. Um, and my
Right.
question is leaning towards like, does this emulator would this emulator possibly have a protection against games that are homebrew, or is this something that remains open source for the user? That's basically what I was going to ask. And I mean,
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer that if you want. Should I answer it now? You just include this part, or like,
yeah, no, I can include it.
um,
I didn't realize how
okay,
to ask the question, and so I deviated a little bit, and I think I worded,
yeah,
you know what I mean? But
yeah,
yeah,
no worries. So basically, you're asking like, um, am I open to, maintaining like copy protections for homebrew stuff that people don't want to be emulated?
yes,
And I actually already had a homebrew dev reach out to me and ask specifically, hey, would you be open to, giving us a hook or something to making sure the games can't run in the emulator? And I said, yeah, I'm totally fine with that. I respect that people are, making an effort, investing real time and resources into this stuff, and they don't want it to be pirated. So of course, I'm willing to help with that. And sure, people could then look into the emulator or look into the software and crack it anyway. Nothing's ever 100% foolproof.
right.
I know like some of the homebrew stuff has actually gone to rather elaborate links to make sure that it can't be pirated particularly easily. I won't go into details of how because I respect the efforts that have been made there. But yeah, ultimately, of course, I respect all the people and efforts. I'm willing to work with them. So
That's fantastic to hear, first of all. I mean, emulation is a tough topic for a lot of people. I mean, the Atari Jaguar is an exceptionally rare console, and there's a lot of people. I'll be honest with you. I was concerned about like value as far as like with these with the games and their worth kind of depreciate with the release of a fully functional emulator or so on. And a lot of the comments that I got with this public post that I had made through Facebook in the Jaguar community was that the fact that there's a way to emulate this is actually fantastic for a lot of people who are interested in the Jaguar. It means that they are exposed in the Atari 50, that is, exposed to games that they never would have otherwise had a chance to play with the unreasonable price hike of the Jaguar. Um,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead. I didn't want to cut you off.
Oh no, I was just agreeing with you. Yeah.
With the Jaguar CD also being more limited than anything else, that makes it even more exceptionally hard, especially considering that without a box, without a case or a memory track, they sell for eBay at like $700 by themselves. I mean, you have people
Yeah.
who are selling some broken ones for like $500 for parts, so that speaks volumes about the rarity and scarcity of the Jaguar CD. So I think a lot of people who are probably
Yeah.
going to watch this video are going to be excited to hear that also that Jaguar CD is a number one priority in the future, if we can get to that point. But
Yeah.
what's something that you might want to say to some people who are watching this in regards to maybe not owning a Jaguar, but having a chance to play it? Like, what would you say to them?
I hope you enjoy it. I mean, like honestly, you can't fight emulation. Eventually everything is and should be emulated because I also really respect what people are doing with Mister with FPGA development. I think that's really important, especially for preservation,
Hmm.
because that's really ultimately the best way that we can preserve this hardware just 100% and make sure that everything is documented, everything can be passed down and replicated through generations even after this original hardware fails. I think
Right.
all that has incredible value, especially from a preservationist and historical perspective. And so, I would never say, don't do that stuff because I want my games to be more valuable.
Right.
That seems like just like a non-starter argument to kind of approach things from that perspective.
Right.
And so, personally, I prefer software emulation just as a programmer. That's what I enjoy more working on. I feel like it's more creative, less methodical. There's more potential to like move it to new platforms to make all kinds of crazy enhancements, which is stuff that I actually really love working on. So and so people have actually approached me from the FPGA community saying, hey, would you come and contribute to like the Mr. Jaguar core and stuff like that? And my stance there is kind of like, I would love to, but I've considered dabbling in FPGA development myself before. I'm sure I'll actually get to it at some point, assuming I live long enough. Dark humor. But but
I
oh,
am
go
glad
ahead.
that
Sorry.
you're still here. That's all I was going to say. I'm glad that you're still here, and I know that the community who's been following your work since the announcement itself are actually very glad that you're here. So I hope that's useful to you in some
Yeah,
way.
I appreciate that. Thank you, and I'm glad as well.
You look good,
But,
first off. So, but
well,
continue.
thank you. Thank you. But yeah, so I'm sure that I will eventually dabble in FPGA development. I find it interesting, intriguing, but in the foreseeable future, I'm definitely going to continue prioritizing the development of the existing emulator, which is of course all software. And to actually meaningfully contribute to something like the Mr. Jaguar core involve a lot of wrap up for me to actually have to wrap up on FPGA development, wrap up on the development of the core. Like I understand it's based on the original net lists, but I don't know if anybody is actually certain that those net lists match final hardware. And so there's a lot of, stuff that would need to be done there.
Right.
And I understand like one of the big Mr. devs also created a brand new repository for a core the other day. Somebody passed that along to me. And so I think maybe this emulator has sparked actual new development interest on that front as well, which is great.
I
But for me to actually meaningfully contribute to it, I'd have to invest a lot of time and wrap up a lot. So me not going over there and helping out is not me being a dick and keeping things to myself. It's just me prioritizing my time, basically.
um I have a curious question to ask here, and this is a question for me. So I don't dabble in emulation a lot, but there are some consoles that I'm a relatively large fan of that going to sound a little weird when I say this to anybody watching, but um I'm actually a fan of the Gamecom and I'm also a fan of the Philips CDI. Those are two consoles that are really hard to emulate for, and it's actually partly because of those two consoles that I kind of got invested in the Jaguar. I didn't grow up with Atari like most people did. I grew up on Sega, Nintendo, and so on and so forth. And so, looking into emulation for those two consoles in particular, which almost next to doesn't exist at all, aside for a new, I think it's called Same CD, which was recently released a couple months back for Retro Arch. I think it was a Levitra core, but the emulation for those has always been difficult. Same thing comes for the Jaguar. Even with Virtual Jaguar, it still can't handle certain games, and that's been one of the most prominent emulators for Atari Jaguar in a while. So the fact that you have created this emulator for a console that has a actually fairly large community versus what it had when it first launched is not only doing wonders for others, but might also inspire other people to make other emulators for these consoles. Because right off of one hand, I can name about three or four of them. I want to say Philips CDI, the Jaguar CD, which technically counts as an add-on, Gamecom, and the Game Park, which was a Korean-only handheld that was released. Emulation for those are things that we probably need to have more of in the emulation community because they're pretty much lost to time. It's hard to collect.
Yeah, I think that, it's just a matter of time, really, because um, there's definitely no shortage of people who want to work on emulators. And
Mhm.
so kind of what I see is happening is, that pool of people continuing to grow and outpacing actual new hardware development. So people are just going to look and say, oh, what's unemulated? What can I actually meaningfully work on? And
Right,
this stuff is eventually going to get picked up and worked on by people.
right,
And so, like, obviously, I'm one of those people in the case of the Jaguar. And I was fortunate enough to be put in a position where I could actually do that development on a contract and still be able to then take it and continue contributing to the community with it, which is entirely, Digital Eclipse should be credited with that. It's not the norm for for an entity in the video game industry to be like, yeah, we own this, but yeah, go ahead and give it to people and let them use it and do stuff with it. So that's I can't sing their praises highly enough on that front. But yeah, I think it's really inevitable that at some point everything's going to be emulated. We're just going to be down to working on the difficulties of working on emulating the new stuff that's coming out and how we can fit that into other hardware and how we can get past all these, new DRM and encryption schemes and all that nonsense.
right. Let me ask another question here, and it's a bit of a loaded question. I mean, obviously, the Atari that's available today is not the same Atari that was in the 90s, 70s, 80s, and so on. Um, and it's I
You
think that
mean like the company Atari?
yeah.
Sorry
Well,
to cut you off there.
no, it's all good. What I'm leading into is that the company that is available today for Atari SA, is not the same Atari of old.
Right.
But regardless of that fact, most people don't realize that. But it's interesting to be able to look at somebody and say, "Hey, I've worked with Atari. I have this. I'm part of this game, part of this company that has worked with Atari. Have you ever found like?" Have you ever been enamored with the idea that you are now technically associated with Atari? Have you had hands-on with the company, or is it ultimately through Digital Eclipse?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a contractor to Digital Eclipse as well, and so I'm basically, my own entity working with Digital Eclipse, who is working with Atari. So I'm once removed from actually working with Atari. I never even like spoke to anybody there or got like any direct feedback. It was all through my Digital Eclipse producer.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right. And are you able to say anything about Atari 50? I know Digital Eclipse announced that it's still coming to the VCS, but they don't have a confirmed date. Are you able to make any comments about that for anybody who's really looking to see that on the VCS?
I mean, I don't think really. It'd probably be something more appropriate for them to answer. I think it's probably safe for me to say I know that it's going to happen. That's about all I can say.
No worries. We'll leave it at no comment. What is it like working with Digital Eclipse? Like, what's your most fond memory?
Honestly, it's all been great. Opportunities they've given me in all these projects. Like being able to work on Aladdin, do the Final Cut thing. Being a huge fan of that game as a kid. And being able to actually take it, extend it meaningfully, add things that I thought would like really help actually fix bugs in the game, stuff like that. That felt like a huge just moment for me. And so like again with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Cowabunga collection, also was a huge fan of most of those games as a kid. So getting to actually work on enhancements and stuff for those games appealed to both my inner developer and my inner fanboy. So yeah, pretty much every project I've been able to work on with those guys has been something that I already had an attachment to, and I was like, wow, this is a great opportunity. So it's just like one after another great things.
That's awesome to hear, first off. And I don't want to cut you off in any way, but we just got hit with the 10-minute timer at the top of the Zoom call.
Yeah.
So we're going to probably try to wrap this up here as quickly as I can. I do want to ask another question in relation to working with the Jaguar. What would you say is probably the hardest hurdle that you've had to face with making the emulator?
It's kind of hard to single any one thing out, but I would say that like the last big hurdle was just in debugging and making compatibility work for like the last, I don't know, 5 to 10% of the software library, which was just like, okay, this thing is breaking here. Gonna go in and debug and figure out exactly why. And at that point, of course, all the bugs that remained were due to insane hardware functionality and things that were not documented or things that were misrepresented in the Jaguar tech reference manual and stuff like that.
Right.
And so that last bit of stuff was just nonstop debugging, troubleshooting, dealing with the Jaguar's crazy risk pipeline, which it has a pretty unique trait of that pipeline, especially because right after right hazards are a thing. And so one of the more insidious bugs in Missile Command 3D was due to the fact that you could leave it in the attract loop. Once it ends the attract loop and it starts loading the level for like one of the demo levels, it would crash. And that ended up being due to a right after right hazard that I was actually trying to debug on hardware. It wouldn't happen when I was actually looking at it and stepping those RISC processors from the 68K. And that was because that process of stepping disrupted the timing, because the timing was dependent on an external memory access. And I apologize if I'm getting too technical here.
No, not at all. The
Okay,
people that are
cool.
going to watch this video are going to understand it more than I will. I've said it in other interviews. I'm not a programmer. I'm not a coder.
Yeah.
Because it helps me understand a little bit more.
Cool. Well, for anybody that's still interested at this point, I'll hurry up and, and wrap this up. But so it was dependent on an external memory access happening, and basically the end of a function was doing a read to a register, which depended on an external memory access. It was returning from that function. It was doing some more stuff in this other function. There are actually actual operations between this and this subsequent operation, which was reading into that register that this operation over here had read into. And because of the way pipelining works, that read or that move into that register over here would then get stopped by the completion of that read that happened over here. And so that was dependent on external memory latency in addition to being a right after right hazard. And so if anything was even slightly off in that timing, which it was in the emulator, it would crash. And of course, this was one of like many things that was a bug in the software, but that they didn't get hit by on hardware because timing just happened to work out so exactly every time. And yeah, there was a lot of stuff like that.
What was the, I don't know how to word this properly, but I'm gonna say it as third grade as I can. What was the funnest game, the most fun you had emulating any of the games? What's a game you have to pick out as your favorite, if any at all?
That's a pretty tough one. I'm sure Tempest 2000 is everybody's go-to. Definitely speaks to me as one of the high quality titles in the library. But I did enjoy, like, I know the Towers 2 came out on other platforms, but I never experienced it on any other platforms. And I found that one especially interesting. It seemed like it was like kind of early, like almost Daggerfall type experience. So, I haven't actually even completed it, so I feel wrong saying it would be my favorite game, but it definitely like intrigued me to encounter it and be like, oh, I never heard of this game. This is actually kind of interesting. Um, yeah, screw it. I'll go with Tempest 2000.
All right, we're coming up on the 4 minute mark here, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and ask one major question. Where can people find you? Where can people find the emulator? What's a closing remark you want to say to those who are watching, or maybe some of your fans, if if some of those fans are watching as well? What would you like to say?
Yeah, so you can find me at richwhitehouse.com. Just go to projects and then BigPEmu is the top one, and then you can find the BigPEmu site and all that. Um, and I suppose I should definitely say thank you to all the patrons that I have on my Patreon thus far. Things have far exceeded my expectations there, and it's actually playing a very meaningful role in supporting me and just like paying the mortgage, getting through having cancer, and I'm definitely not doing as much contract work as I otherwise would be because of the situation, and so that this actually couldn't have come at a better time to have all this support um, behind me on the Patreon account, and so thank you everybody who is helping there. It really genuinely means a lot to me. I can't overstate that. Um, and yeah, I mean, definitely. So I've actually had the experience quite a few times where somebody reaches out because of this emulator, and I'll say, "Oh, if you're interested in me doing this Jaguar VR support, you might also be interested in this Sega VR project that I did, where I basically, resurrected that hardware by reverse engineering some software that was meant to interface with it." And they're like, "Oh my God, you're the guy that did that." And so I guess I'll say, feel free to check out my other work as well, because I might be a guy that you encountered but didn't know already.
So you brought something up, and we don't have a whole lot of time. I want to be able to have at least another 30 seconds to wrap up a farewell. So I want to ask you real quick, what does the emulator have in store for VR support? I mean, there wasn't many games VR related for the Jaguar. There was one that was released, which was the VR for Missile Command 3D. Does that mean we can hook up our own headsets to the emulator, perhaps, or maybe give that a proper try?
Yes, so definitely check out the work I did on Sega VR because that's basically what my hope and intent is for the Jaguar VR to be able to have that kind of experience where you can actually funnel it into a modern headset and experience the Jaguar VR as it was meant to be. But that is contingent on me actually reverse engineering Missile Command, looking into the early build of it that was released as well, and seeing what remains protocol interface for that headset. If it's only the tracker implemented there, but or if it's also got some implementation of stereo rendering, that would be great because then I can
I'll
implement
tell you,
that.
I'll tell you what. And I'm gonna text this to you, but I know some people you can reach out to who have working prototypes if that's useful to your project.
I
But
have heard that is floating around. Yeah, that would be great.
I'll do that. But we're coming up on our last minute here. I wish I could ask you so many more questions, and I would love to have you back in the future if you're open to it, if there's any more questions raised from the audience. But
Yeah,
I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, and I'm also speaking somewhat for some of the community members, we're grateful that you're making a speedy recovery from cancer, and we're glad that you're here, and we're very grateful for the support that you've done, not just for the emulator, but for the community. It really does mean a lot to many of us.
but thanks, man. I really appreciate that. It's really, I mean, that's kind of you. That's kind of everybody. And I have actually been really overwhelmed by just all the support and just the outpouring of people that have come out and been like, "Hey, it's great that you're doing this. I really appreciate it."
Right.
So I really appreciate all of you. It's really been a heartwarming experience for this otherwise heartless old man. So
Earlier, you were talking about some possible development for the Atari Jaguar VR headset that was ultimately never released in the 1990s. Can you give us a brief rundown on what your plans with that are?
yeah, so if you're not familiar, definitely check out my work with Sega VR because what I'm going to describe is basically that. Where the idea is to take a game that implemented the headset. I mean, we're speaking here from the standpoint of assuming that I don't have access to the headset hardware, which I currently don't. That may change, as you've already mentioned yourself. Somebody who might be able to, contribute hardware for me to actually poke and play around with.
Right.
But just assuming that that doesn't happen, my stance there would be to reverse engineer some software that's already implemented the headset. And so the only software I know of that has done that in the Jaguar library is Missile Command 3D. I believe I haven't actually reverse engineered it to confirm, but I believe the final retail still has the head tracking code in it. I need to look into the earlier beta that was released as well and see if that has potentially more protocol code in it, or if it actually interfaced with stereoscopic rendering in any way, because that would definitely be important, for me to do something resembling like a full headset implementation as I did with the Sega VR. And so it's kind of contingent on me actually doing that research, reverse engineering, seeing what is actually implemented and what I can then actually emulate from there. But the idea is basically to recreate that entire VR experience and be able to emulate the original headset and hook that into like something like OpenVR, like I did for the Sega VR, and allow you to actually use the modern headset and emulate the VR experience.
So, and this is just kind of piggybacking off of what you said here about, Missile Command 3D being the only one. It's the only official one, and I don't know. So maybe anybody watching this can probably quote me, or not quote me, but can correct me. I do believe that and I don't believe these are online. I know Nerf Max Force had a brief mention of possible connectivity to VR. I know there's a Centipede 2000 or Centipede 3D. I don't remember. I know there's a demo video of that. And then there's also a demo video of Dactyl Joust, which is like a 10-second clip. So I don't know if any of those are floating around or if anybody's willing to step forward in light of that. But if you're watching this and you are, and it has VR capabilities, definitely reach out to this gentleman right here because he can bring that to life for people in 2022, 2023.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody has access to anything that is implemented, any degree of VR support, that would be great, both for me reverse engineering a protocol and for actual compatibility testing once I've implemented it.
So, just a general curiosity, and I'm probably going to make this known in just about every video that I interview involving development, but I'm not a programmer or developer in any sense at all. I don't understand really how code works. I'm not. How hard, let's say piggybacking off of the Sega VR, how hard would you say it would be for Jaguar VR with there being so limited of information? I'm assuming having the prototype would definitely make things easier, but without it, would it be harder to implement it for your emulator?
Um, yeah, I mean, it really comes down to what is actually implemented in the software. If I can't, get access to the hardware and, poke at it and figure out how to emulate stuff that, well, no software might have even, interfaced with, which is, gets into an interesting thing in itself of like, okay, if I have the hardware, I can make a complete implementation of emulating this thing. But then no software uses it. So then I probably would be motivated to actually go into Missile Command 3D and implement anything that hadn't been implemented and be like, here's a game that now implements this thing fully that didn't actually exist before.
So is this more of like a what if for you, or is this a definite that you really want to do for the emulator?
Oh yeah, it's a definite that I'll get to it at some point. It hasn't really been prioritized in terms of like I did the Patreon poll to see what order people wanted me to work on things in, and I
Right.
believe the VR support was pretty far down on that list, below like CD support, debugger builds, Linux builds. I think there was maybe one or two other things before it, so it's kind of down on the list, but it's definitely something that I intend to work on.
Right. And you've mentioned before the Sega VR. Could you go into a little bit more detail about that? Like how was reception and what all have you been able to get running fully?
Yeah, so that was the project for the Video Game History Foundation, and we basically, thanks to Dylan Mansfield at Gaming Alexandria, I was able to get the source code from one of the developers of a game called Nuclear Rush, and that is one of the very few titles that actually got far enough along with the Sega VR to implement at the actual head tracking and stereoscopic rendering, the whole shebang. Um, and I actually have since then come across some builds for other Sega VR games, but unfortunately, and reverse engineering them, and I haven't actually announced this yet or like talked about this. It's a plan to eventually, I've got all the game history stuff kind of sideburnered at the moment with everything else going on. But coming across some other Sega VR games, unfortunately, the builds of them don't actually implement the Sega VR at all. It was basically like they developed the game, the intent was for it to be used with Sega VR, but it wasn't until later on that I think the developers actually got like the prototype headset hardware and were able to implement that hardware in the games. And so it's very fortunate that Nuclear Rush was actually, one of the games that got taken far enough.
Mhm.
And we got the source code for it, and I was able to go through that, figure out how it was trying to interface with the headset, and then implement that in a Sega Genesis emulator. And um, don't know how much detail to go into in terms of like the actual guts of it, but it's basically like a serial communication protocol. Some assumptions made about timing and the stereoscopic rendering and which frame is which and all that. But yeah, I ended up being able to actually fully emulate that and pipe it through OpenVR, which allowed me to use a Vive headset and actually experience the stereoscopic rendering, pipe the head tracking into the actual original head tracking, which the original Sega VR supported yaw, so left and right and pitch up and down, but it did not support like roll. So you're kind of like in a tank type situation.
Right. Gotcha.
um, which I expected to feel a lot worse than it actually did once I, got to experience it and actually played with it a little bit. I didn't actually find it jarring at all to only, have this kind of movement tracked. Didn't get like VR motion sickness or anything from the low frame rate. So it was a much better experience than I expected, honestly.
This is going to be a little bit of an offhand question, but Oculus, actually, there are some emulators that people can run on Oculus, and I've seen people running, what's it called? Nintendo's Virtual Boy, which it
Yeah.
basically just puts a screen in front of your head, but I can't remember the name. The name will lose me right now, but there's a boxing game in there and there's also a Starship game, kind of like Star Fox as well, that kind of fits the general narrative. That would probably be the best one to emulate on, say, an Oculus. Um, would your emulator maybe in the future support that if somebody really wanted to just kind of have that, that interface for themselves?
Are we talking about the Jaguar or the Genesis one at this point?
Either one. Just pretty much, if you decide to use your, I guess in this case we're really talking Jaguar. But let's say as a general whole, all of it. Would you be working on an emulator for that people could probably upload to their Oculus or something like that? Is that something people can look out for?
Um, I'm not entirely sure. Like the first step is just to implement OpenVR in it, and OpenVR works with a pretty wide variety of headsets. But I think there probably would be some problems with anything that expects the headset to be the actual device target. You need separate special builds and stuff for that.
Right.
And so whether I go, that extra step for that stuff, and I will admit I have an inherent bias against anything Oculus because it's all meta, and I would really rather if that entire industry was not headed by that company, but I realize it's not the reality. So so it kind of comes down to, the actual interest people have and whether anybody's poking me to make that happen once the time comes.
All right. Well, that's pretty much all the questions that I have. Was there anything else that you wanted to say in regards to this particular part of the video?
I don't think so. I think pretty good here.
With that, unfortunately, I'm going to have to end the video. So for those of you guys who are watching, my name is Kazdan Azan with Crash Productions, and this is Rich Whitehouse, the creator of BigPEmu or BigPEmu Emulator. Sorry, Jaguar. Thank you so much, man. It was a pleasure to have
Yeah,
you.
thanks for having me. It's good talking to you.
Have a blessed one.
Likewise.
About drop my keyboard. Stop.